Hello and welcome to our Storytelling Through AAC webinar. We've got lots of people who've pre-registered for this pre-recorded webinar, and we've got a lot of different people with a lot of different backgrounds who are coming to the webinar today. So we are going to talk a little bit about AAC and the context of AAC in terms of vocabulary. We're going to talk a little bit about why storytelling is important. And we're also going to talk through some case studies where we've worked on storytelling with people that we've been supporting, and then we'll draw some conclusions for this at the end. I'm Andrea Sharples. I'm the Clinical Director of ATtherapy, and Fran Sephton is going to co-present the webinar, and she's one of the clinical managers at ATtherapy. And the webinar will be uploaded to the website and the ATtherapy YouTube channel following today. So we just wanted to share initially with you an amazing resource that we found, and to reference Anna-Lou Waller, who's one of the inspirations for us doing this work with Fran with her Assistive Technology Masters. And storytelling is really important for everybody. So we do share stories, not just to tell information, but to build relationships with people. If you think about how we interact with people, we want listeners to share our reactions, have a sense of our experiences, and really this is an amazing book that looks at using storytelling to support children and adults with special needs. So we've definitely taken a lot of inspiration from all of the chapters within this book.
So just a little bit more about our context and how Andrea and I work. So we're both speech and language therapists, and we wanted to use the Me's, Reasons and Opportunities model as kind of setting the groundwork really for the webinar today. And it's a model that we use often within assessments and also training. So when we're introduced to our clients, they often have no or very limited means of communication, which is that left-hand circle. So they may have no functional use of speech, limited gesture and signs, and they may not be able to communicate kind of their basic wants and needs. So our role is to identify a communication solution which gives them access to an effective means of communication. And once that's been established, we then work on expanding out the reasons why someone communicates. So we all communicate so much more than just expressing our basic wants and needs. So if we think about when we get home from work today, we'll often greet someone coming into the house. We will ask them questions like, how was your day? We'll answer questions. It was one. We will make comments, say how we're feeling, express our preferences, say what we want for tea, protest or deny, saying I'm not watching that on TV, for example, and we negotiate and make choices and decisions. And unfortunately, it is still commonplace that we see a lot of communication systems which just fulfill that need of making requests. So it really sort of pulled me in when hearing Anna-Lou present about storytelling, because that is a function and a reason for communication that is sometimes missed. But finally, just to explain the last part of the model, which is the opportunities section, we want to make sure that the people that we support have the opportunities to communicate effectively across their week with a number of different communication partners. And it's not just limited to that hour session, for example, that they would see me and Andrea, that they can effectively communicate across contexts and with different communication partners.
Again, this is just a little bit of background about communicative competencies, and those speech and language therapists who are on this webinar, I'm sure, are really, really familiar with all of these communicative competencies from Janice Light. And storytelling, as Fran just said, is not an obvious reason for communication that is frequently thought about in terms of programming onto AAC devices, but it does cover and hit all of these domains. So Janice Light's model looks at operational competencies. So how does the AAC user operate the device with touch, switch, eye gaze? How can they use certain functions such as volume, which are obviously really important in terms of having a means for communication. Linguistic competence is probably the next obvious one in terms of storytelling. So AAC is language, and how is it best represented on the device? And we'll have a little look about this, about how vocabulary packages are organised, and do an overview of this in a later slide. But how can we, this is basically what are the basic building blocks of language on the device, and how is the person putting that language together? What's the best way for them? The strategic competence is using what you have on the system and in the environment for the best effective communication. So, for example, somebody I was working with recently couldn't find the word sister on their device. And so he wanted to say that the lady was his grandma's sister. And he said Sophie, which is his sister's name, granddad, grandma, Sophie, to explain that this was grandma's sister. So he's using the words he knows and can find there to explain something, and that's a great example of strategic competence, using what you have and what you can find to say what you want to say. Social competence is a really important one with storytelling, I think. So this is using the system to build and maintain social relationships. And if we think about what Fran just said in terms of how we all use storytelling about our day to build our relationships with people, this is probably the best way people build relationships, through personal storytelling. And so this is a really important competency that we can focus on through the storytelling communicative function. The psychosocial competence is about the motivation and resilience for using a device. Comes from internal feelings, but can also come from external validation. So again, through storytelling and that sort of social interaction, you can get a lot of that internal and external validation from sharing that personal information. And although it isn't an obvious thing that's mentioned a lot with AAC, in the most recent version of the dynamic AAC goals grid published by Toby, so the DAG3 you might know it as, there are targets that cover elements of storytelling within this assessment. So it's really good to see that those elements of storytelling are coming into some of the resources that are being provided by AAC suppliers.
So I'm just going to expand upon what AAC is. Apologies if I'm teaching some of you to kind of suck eggs, or you know this kind of acronym, but I'm aware that there might be some people on the webinar who are new to this kind of field. So Andrea and I both specialise in AAC and assistive technology. But what it stands for basically is augmentative and alternative communication. So there are some people, for example, who might need a tool to help augment or support their communication. So they may have some speech, for example, but that might be unclear to all communication partners, and therefore they might need an AAC tool in certain environments and with certain people. Other individuals may have limited or no functional use of speech, so they require an alternative system, which is where the kind of AAC acronym comes from. It's important to note that people who have AAC tend to have a physical impairment and may have additional sensory and intellectual disabilities. And as Andrea mentioned before, I'm currently undertaking a master's in assistive technologist, and I'm really interested and passionate about how to support people to access these communication tools in the most effective and least effortful way. So there's been loads of changes in terminology across the years. You may have seen high-tech, low-tech, paper-based, electronic, powered, non-powered or unpowered. But just to kind of break it down, if we're looking at aided AAC systems, they can range from something unpowered or paper-based, which is just like the symbol board shown on the bottom right hand of the screen. And then you could move to something electronic or powered, such as like single switch voice recorders, which we're going to talk about a lot later on, text-to-speech apps on tablets and iPads, accessed via different means, so things like eye gaze, using eye gaze and switches. And the individuals that we often work with are really skilled unaided communication users as well. So they have got really individual, often and unique ways of kind of expressing themselves using gestures, sophisticated signing systems like Makaton, vocalizations, facial expressions, and eye pointing. And those are often really, really skilled methods that they've established for a number of years that their familiar communication partners understand really, really well. So yeah, that's just a little bit of a background into what AAC is, and we're going to specifically focus on storytelling with AAC users today.
So when we think about storytelling, it can be really difficult for AAC users to participate in storytelling. If we think about speakers and storytelling, then it may sort of shift and be quite fluid. So I may start telling you a story about something, it may spark something in you, and then we end up having quite a complex conversation about that particular story or that particular theme. So an AAC, it can be particularly challenging with that because of the speed of communication, but also because utterances and words are quite often prepared in advance on communication systems. And so it can be quite hard to have that flexibility of communication within that. So language can be presented with text or spelling, whole words or whole phrases. It might be, you might have heard the phrase Gestalt language processors, who are people who use whole phrases as chunks of language effectively within their communication strategies. So it can be quite difficult to have that flexibility in communication when you're using a communication system that has been pre-programmed, because you may not be able to find and discover that flexibility within a free narrative. It's quite good AAC, and as Fran talked about at the start, in sort of transactional communication, so goal-driven communication of needs and wants, and the sharing of specific information. But this kind of free-flowing narrative can be a little bit more difficult when you're using an AAC system.
People who use aided language have lots of kind of unique cognitive demands, which I've placed some of which you can see on screen. So they have to find a word or sentence within their vocabulary. They have to know the target item, remember where that is stored in the system, remember what symbol or icon represents it, while still maintaining attention on the conversation, which is often fast-paced. They then have to then sequence that information and structure it into a grammatically meaningful utterance. So there's a really high cognitive load. And there is this conversational asymmetry that we often see, where AAC users sort of rarely initiate topics or conversation. They might just use one or two word utterances and just give the kind of key information carrying words. They'll rarely sort of share personal stories. And evidence and research has found that there can sometimes be a reliance on that low-tech AAC or unaided communication style. But Andrea will expand a little bit more upon that in the next slide.
So as Fran said, there's been probably the biggest, well, quite a large study on AAC and challenges for AAC users in conversation and storytelling, as we're talking about today. So I think everybody can relate if they've been talking to someone who uses AAC with that quote at the top. I talked more to keep the conversation going and to make it feel easier. Felt like I should fill in the blanks with my partner when they couldn't find the word. And those long pauses, due to the pace of someone using AAC and their communication, can feel uncomfortable at first if you're not used to those pauses. And so, you know, you do get this asymmetry in structure. So the communication partner may do that, fill in the blanks. They may feel uncomfortable and not know what the AAC user can say and may dominate the speaking time. Participants using AAC usually respond to communication rather than initiate. Research has also shown that speaking partners control the topics, and AAC users are not necessarily the people sort of guiding and controlling those topics. answering yes/no questions can be quite a safe space for everybody to be in. So you do find that there's an over-reliance on yes/no, and also those sort of timing challenges. And all of these things on the slide are challenges for communication partners. So anytime that we're looking at introducing anything with an AAC user, the communication partner is such a huge element of this, really, in terms of, what does it take and what does it mean to be a good communication partner in that natural asymmetry that does occur in communication with an AAC user. You may not know, for example, if I leave the space, where will the conversation go? What vocabulary does the person have on the system? And can the AAC user meet the demands of the conversation? And it's about the communication partner having training to know what their role in the communication, in a more equal communication, could look like.
Just to expand on that a little bit about the challenges that AAC users face with speed, that's also the case for written communication as it is with spoken. And we've found that when working with AAC users around narratives, we've often found that the quantity of their written output is limited compared to their peers. So on screen you can see, apologies about the quality of the image, but it's more about the kind of length really. Are two pieces of written work from two of the most competent AAC users that Andrea and I work with. So the client on the left uses a symbol-based vocabulary using eye gaze on electronic AAC or powered AAC, and the client on the right uses text-based vocabulary using switches on powered AAC. And both of these pieces took over an hour to complete and include some really great, grammatically rich and correct information, but it was really fatiguing for those clients to produce that written work. And both of these clients struggle with fatigue, and this can mean that they can fall behind with schoolwork and require kind of that reduced and adapted curriculum.
So this type of exchange is simple retelling of an event, so a simple personal narrative or story. And you can see there's quite a large need here for communication partner scaffolding in this storytelling. And you can see how that imbalance and asymmetry in communication is evident to get the information from this storytelling. And a similar interaction with a verbal pupil would look very different. And here we can see sort of reliance on yes/no, parent introducing the topic. So the parent's raising that topic, the AAC user is replying yes to that question. And again, the parent then leads again with another question, and the AAC user replies with a simple word. So, here we can see all of those elements that we talked about before in terms of the communication partner leading the interaction, reliance on yes/no responses, and the AAC user not leading that interaction, leading that storytelling.
So all of these challenges we kind of see within our organisational context, and myself and Andrea will just kind of give a little bit more information about ATtherapy to help you understand why we specifically wanted to work on this topic with our AAC users. So we work within the medico-legal sector and are often working with their client and their large teams around that person on a really regular basis, often weekly. And we work with clients with all ages, with a range of needs, but we primarily work with people with acquired and traumatic brain injury. I would say this is probably higher now, Andrea, but I would say over 80% really of our caseload use AAC and assistive technology, if not more. And as a result of that, we have got a team a number of speech and language therapists who have specialisms in AAC. We have assistive technologists as well, and we have a team of mentors whose role is to inspire others and show them what's possible using their AAC. We also have therapists with different specialisms and speech and language therapy assistants. So we have speech and language therapists specialising in things like motor speech disorders, social emotional mental health, higher level language difficulties, and we have assistants specialising in things like education, dysphagia, and assistive technology as well. So we work with clients and their families where often a lot of trauma has occurred. So we make sure that all of our therapists sort of embed a trauma-informed practice and approach to make sure that we aren't doing any interventions or input with the individual that will re-traumatise them or their families. And as I mentioned, we work often with people with brain injury, and as a consequence of that, normally they have executive function impairments, which you can see with some of the image on screen. And these impairments do actually affect an individual's ability to share a personal narrative. And lots of those bubbles on screen are actually sort of target areas for our therapists to work on. So we really felt that this work was really relevant for our sector, but we highlighted that it was a piece of work that really needed that working with the wider team, that transdisciplinary working with other therapists, the client obviously being at the heart of that, and their team around them. And that's really not a new approach to how we sort of work at ATtherapy. We're often working with professionals like psychologists, for example, and doing joint pieces of work. So, for example, one project I was involved in was co-designing a resource called My Ability to support individuals to understand their disability and develop self-acceptance.
So if we just return back to leading into the case studies we're going to talk about, I think it's important to have a think about how vocabulary can be laid out on an AAC system. So different vocabularies are organised in quite different ways. So we might have things like pragmatic branch starters, which we'll see in one of our case studies later, which means you go to your vocabulary through what the meaning of the communication is. I want to tell you something would lead you to a story. I want would lead you to a request. I feel would lead you to expressing a feeling. So those pragmatic branch starters would lead you down there. And obviously how you get to your word then sort of gives you a lot of context and interprets the meaning of that word when you get there at the end. So it's really important to think about how you're getting to the words within those AAC systems as well as the words themselves, because it massively influences the meaning of the word that you've spoken because of the route that you get there. Because if you go down, where it's saying I feel happy, then obviously that's related to yourself. But if you go down it, it was a happy time, then that's a completely different meaning of that word or interpretation of that word. You might have things like activity boards, which you can see at the bottom left here. So they would be boards that would be related to the thing that you're immediately engaged in. So this one is about bubbles, but when I'm in that board, unless I have a way of getting out of that board, I can only say what's in there. So when we're talking about storytelling, then we need to think about those ideas that this story may be free-flowing. So you need to think about not kind of locking people into one particular activity or one particular story. You want them to be able to get out of that and free flow into something else, to be able to have that flexibility of communication within that story. You might have something category based. So you go into something about typical categories like places or activities or things like that, which would enable you to have that movement between levels. A text-based communication system is one that's obviously used for somebody who is literate and may have spelling ability, reading ability, and ability to build their own words and phrases through text and spelling, which really is the way you're going to be able to say anything that you would like to say. You're not reliant on somebody like Fran or I or family pre-programming anything or putting vocabulary in there. You're able to say whatever you would like to be able to say if you do have that literacy ability, which is why literacy is always a core part of any therapy that anyone at ATtherapy with someone with AAC puts into place. And then motor planning, bottom right, is probably the most recognisable vocabulary for motor planning, and that means that you can see here a min-speak system whereby a combination of symbols on the screen leads you to be able to say the individual words within that system. And again, this is quite a rich vocabulary system and would mean that you'd be able to have access to thousands of words once you knew that system very well.
So what we tend to see, particularly in kind of schools, specialist education, we'll often see news programmed just under one cell on a device or under one button, like a single message device, which can be seen with the Big Mac on screen. So the client just hits that, and for example, it would say, my class went to the school today, we saw the penguins, monkeys, lion and flamingos, I had a great day. So that is obviously just one activation and then a whole string of the news. If you can see on screen next to the Big Mac, I've edited news pages before to facilitate more of that AAC user participation in constructing that message where possible, and in allowing for that natural pauses and that transactional communication, which Andrea referred to before. So that on screen is an adapted version of a news page on a vocabulary called Word Power D. And again, you'll see some similarities within the case studies as we move forward to those.
So this is again just taking us back into that storytelling, and we can see by reading this, really, you know, we've got a lot of challenges about how to recreate this in AAC, particularly those AAC users who are still developing those language skills. So the ability to relate and share personal experience is a complex skill. It develops in early childhood, is facilitated through scaffolding and successful experiential learning. And it's that sort of early experience of communication and retelling those stories that, you know, we've got to recognise that our AAC users have not had the opportunity to do that. And if they are still learning language now, then we need to be able to give them the structure to be able to retell these stories. So if you watch friends telling stories or stand back and watch yourself, you'll notice that key aspects of conversational telling are very different to stories you read on a page. So the space is intimate, people lean into each other, there's a rhythm of telling and responding, and that's as important as the content, really. And the story is built around an event that stands out as different enough to deserve attention. And Labov called this a reportable event, and it's identifying those reportable events. And how do we know what are those reportable events for the people that we're supporting? And reportable events generate an emotional reaction. It might be surprise, excitement, pride, amusement, fear, sadness, curiosity, bewilderment. And it's that emotion that motivates us to share the memory. So part of this storytelling is about what are those stories, what stories are important to our AAC users, what do they want to retell.
When you meet new communication partners, the pattern is actually you tend to repeat the same stories over and over again, but you'll change certain elements as you practice and kind of internalize the story. The core of the story, however, will be the same, and it does become relatively scripted over time. So to become skilled and independent narrators, we need to tell a story a number of times, both to new listeners, but also to ourselves. And it's important to come back to that conversational dyad again and think about how successful storytelling is dependent on the communication partner's knowledge of the context of the story so that they can ask appropriate questions throughout.
And what usually happens is maybe what you were expecting to happen when you came to the webinar today, I'm not sure. But in most cases, when we talk about storytelling, we're talking about fictional storytelling, and we're focused on the classroom and within that context of literacy teaching. And within that context, we might provide people with templates. They're able to generate and tell simple stories. They might have that structure of when, who, where, did what was the problem. But I think it's really important for our AAC users to have that personal storytelling opportunity as well as the fictional storytelling opportunity. But I think when we look at AAC resources, even though more personal storytelling support is available in AAC increasingly, I think most of the things that we've seen in storytelling have been fictional. So those grids, for example, where you choose a person, it might be an alien, and then the next grid takes you to different places, an alien in a castle, next one takes you to a problem that happened, and it's that error-free story building, those fictional story building. We've got lots of experience of those in the classroom, but not necessarily those personal stories that I think it's really important that AAC users have the chance to tell. And I'm sure, again, this is something that you're familiar with seeing in special school settings or group of AAC users. So AAC storytelling in a group. So you might be reading out a story and have Boo on a single switch device to join in with a story. You might have key phrases, repetitive phrases. I sent him back on Zezu is one that enables people to join in with those fictional stories. Or it might be phrases like, and then what happened next, in order to request, turning over of the page and telling the next bit of the story. And they're all things about group storytelling and encouraging storytelling that are important. But Fran and I thought it was really important to take it one step further than this.
That leads me on to kind of the inspiration for today's talk, really, and I hope I do this justice, sort of trying to explain about the project called How Was School Today, which was delivered during a university teaching week last summer by Professor Anna Lou Waller, who's one of my university lecturers. And as she was presenting, I started to message Andrea, as it was just really sort of sparking lots of motivation and interest. I just thought it was such a lovely project to enable children who used AAC to share stories about their day at school. But instead of having that staff store the conversational material into the device, the project focused on exploring how this could be possible using data to text technology. So How Was School Today actually provided the child with automatically generative narrative utterances based on clever technology, sensor, and kind of other data. So it was such a new concept for people to kind of get their heads around, particularly for staff and parents. So they started to create a simulator just to demonstrate how data could be collected throughout the day, stored in a database, and how that data to text technology could then be used to share different versions of a story. And they would use this kind of simulation to talk the parents and staff through it. But cleverly, they embedded a researcher within the special school who shadowed the children throughout the day and just really looked at how staff were supporting the children to share narratives, which was mainly done at the time by pre-recording messages onto something like a Big Mac or their own AC systems under one big button, which says news, or writing in homeschool diaries. And having this model actually highlighted practical issues within the school day. For example, when the child's day veered away from kind of the norm or the usual timetable, that's when the really interesting things happened. They used in this project as well some use of voice recorders to record some nuances of the story which couldn't be captured by the data. So here you can see, sorry about the quality of the images, but you can see briefly how a narrative is generated as the person transitions to a music class. 4 messages were kind of generated from that throughout the day. And then here's a picture of the interface that was used. So at the top, there was sort of generated event narrations, which the individual could choose at the top of the screen. Then they had different events in the middle of the screen, which consists of several messages. And then at the bottom was a really nice element where the AAC user could evaluate the event using kind of emojis, if you like, or smiley buttons. So here is an example on screen. The AAC user is in red, and her speech and language therapist came in the next day and was asking what she'd been up to the day before. And she was able to share this rich information using the interface that was on the screen before, using a head switch and her electronic or powered AAC. So she said, then I went to junior primary instead of reading. And the speech language therapist said, right, oh, no reading, junior primary. I wonder why that was. A visitor was there. Oh, a visitor, right. I wonder what the visitor was doing. The dental hygienist came to give a talk. Oh, dental hygienist. A visitor was there. That was the visitor. Okay, that's why you went to junior primary. What did you think of the talk? She is nice. Oh, she was nice. That's good. Very good. So it's a really nice back and forth interaction where that AAC user is actually sharing a lot of information about their news from the day before. So a lot of the storytelling research projects at university are developing systems and strategies to allow children to share their experiences in a conversational environment. And they're focusing on use of multi-message voice recording switches, such as a step-by-step, which Andrea will show you in a bit, and also their own electronic AAC systems. And the aims of the projects that they're doing there is to enable children to relate their own experiences, including their feelings and their emotions, to promote that interactive conversation in which it's really collaborative and everybody's participating in the storytelling, to support multimodal communication. So that's including vocalizations and non-verbal responses as well, and to support children to communicate the meaning the story has to them.
So when we look at developing storytelling for AAC users, there's 4 stages we can go through, and these are taken from some of the work in that initial book that we talked about on the very first slide. So we've got to identify those stories. What are those events or those stories that spark that emotional response for our AAC users, and how do we identify them? How do we prepare the story words? How do we store them? Where are they in the AAC device? So those vocabularies we looked at before, depending on which AAC system is used, how is their vocabulary organised, and how is it therefore best stored on their device? Then how are we going to teach that so that the individual can retrieve that story and know where it is stored? How are we going to evaluate whether that was a story that was a useful one to put on for that AAC user or not? And then how are we going to get that story narration? How are we going to get a little bit of that ebb and flow? So we don't have that asymmetry of interaction, and we have that more even conversation style for successful narratives and successful social relationship building.
So here are some initial thoughts. I'm going to start sort of our case study section now. And I'd really like to highlight that it is very early days for ATtherapy to kind of be thinking and developing new resources around this. But following the uni week, I came away and I started to think about some ideas using the Grid 3 software, just prototyping a bit of ideas really that could help some of my AAC users on my caseload to share personal narratives. And I came up with this concept of my story albums, which could span across the years and allow the AAC user to log lots of their favourite stories that they may share over and over again with different communication partners. And obviously this was all editable, but it was just kind of something I was playing around with at the time. So I started to think about the content, and I went into the first album, which is When I Was a Dot, and I'd just taken my daughter to a festival. So I started to look at the structure in which I could structure that story from the festival. So I felt it was really important not to give all the information in one go under one cell in order to create further communication opportunities and kind of build that suspense throughout the story. I felt that this structure wouldn't require too many activations because a lot of my clients struggle with fatigue. And well, 90% of people who have a brain injury struggle with fatigue. So I didn't want to make it too many activations within the grid set. But I added on the left, you can see kind of questions to allow that experience to be more interactive and provide that scaffold for the communication partner too, which hopefully won't be new to any speech therapist, because that is a lot of what we will see in kind of narrative interventions, and kind of use consistent structure and colours to those. And by sharing the story in segments, I found that it was easier to step through the story and then invite pauses, comments, questions from a communication partner. But I did still feel that it needed to link the AAC user back to their main vocabulary so that they could go and extend the conversation. And that conversation obviously may steer off in different angles depending on what the communication partner says and their sort of shared experience and understanding of the context. In later versions, I started to play around with adding music, as that can support memory retrieval, taking you back to a certain time. I also added visual support in the form of photos and videos, which you can see on screen, which I was thinking would help people recall the memory. And I also added an emotion scale to a later version to help the AAC user explain how they felt talking about the memory. You know, what was it about that reportable event, and what emotion did that sort of evoke? You know, was it good? Was it scary? And then also another feature which I felt was important for AAC users was this kind of hold the floor message to make sure that they could gain the communication partner's attention and keep that throughout the story. So the album concept I thought would allow a user to retain and retell their favourite stories for longer term use, rather than just having like a news cell, for example, that was being wiped daily or weekly off their device. So I just wanted to now share an experience with one of my clients on my caseload, Dee. He is someone that I just couldn't stop thinking about when Annalou was presenting, because although I'd done a lot of personalisation of his device, I realised that he really couldn't share a personal narrative, particularly about his past. And so I just wanted to really think how I could make that possible for him. So he is 31, he's got a diagnosis of locked-in syndrome, he's in a care home setting and had a traumatic brain injury in his teens. We've been supporting him to use electronic AAC using eye gaze, and there are several times throughout the sort of day where unfortunately this client suffers with pain and discomfort, and so isn't able to use eye gaze technology. So he has various kind of paper-based solutions to help him to communicate in those situations using an approach called partner-assisted scanning. He's a fantastic gentleman with an amazing sense of humour. He follows sort of conversational language really well, loves a bit of sarcasm, and he's learning to use a vocabulary package called VocoChat to support his expression. And recently we've really discovered that he has a real passion for gaming, and we've been able to make that possible for him using adaptive technology, which has been brilliant. But when I was kind of thinking about starting this piece of work with him, actually there was lots of sort of questions to consider. So would adding sort of stories be triggering for him and his family, particularly if they're kind of focused on the past? Or would that really help him process what had happened to him? You know, process his injury and connect with others by sharing more information about himself. Because he has such a fantastic sense of humour, could sharing those stories be really funny and engaging for him? So following kind of working with his MDT and himself, we have started this process with him with a focus on stories that he finds funny. But I'd like to highlight how heavily I've had to rely on his key communication partners to tell me how he would have shared that story, what elements of that story were the funny bits, getting obviously some of the more rich information around that, so the photos, the music, and you can just see briefly the start of the work we've started with him on screen here now, which has been really nice to kind of see his responses to this and just learn and connect and find out more about him, really.
So the second case study we're going to share is a primary aged boy in mainstream school, and he also uses VocaChat. It was a bit of a coincidence that we've both chosen people who use this vocabulary, but he uses an adaptive format of VocaChat. So I've just done a quick screenshot of his front page here. So it does have pragmatic branch starters, but can also have categories, single words, and spelling within it. And for him, we're working on a hide reveal basis. So we hid a lot of the categories at the start, and there still are a lot of things hidden on the pages underneath all of these categories. And we're building his vocabulary up from that. So the idea being that he'll know where that vocabulary is, and just more and more will be added rather than changing the location of things as we add more vocabulary. So we started with the quick words in the chat on the left here, which we moved onto the left for accessibility reasons. And then we started with the I want and I feel buttons, quickly moving on to I think. And underneath that, it's very simple at the moment. I like it, I don't like it, I'm not sure. So again, we've got lots of things that we can make this a richer vocabulary as he learns this vocabulary. We added people after that, so he could call for attention, call people over to him when he wanted something. And now finally, the latest thing that we've revealed is this reddish coloured column down the middle. So something's wrong. Can I tell you something, and can I ask you something? Yeah, and obviously the can I tell you something is where the storytelling comes into it. So if we just nip to the next slide, Fran, and we think about those 4 stages we talked about before. Stage 1 is identification of the stories. And we drafted a quick questionnaire because, you know, if you say to somebody, what's the words this person wants to say, it's really hard to think on the spot. So we wanted to give some sort of structure to try and draw out those events and things that have that emotional response. So are there regular routines at home that he enjoys? Are there regular family events that he likes or dislikes? Are there any one-off events that have turned into family stories that he was involved in or likes the retelling of? What does he like, dislike about everyday family life or school life? What are the important family events? And how can we structure the vocabulary to help him with structuring this story? And when we started going through this questionnaire, it was really difficult for the family to think about and identify in the moment. So we needed to give them a lot of time, a lot of structure, a lot of help really in trying to think about what stories would be most important to him. So we hit the next slide, thank you. So when we hit the can I tell you something button, this is where we come to. So we've talked a lot about the my news element, but we've also got there a story. And then obviously share some personal information and things about me, things I like, things I don't like. So because it's so challenging to try and identify those events that have that emotional response, and Fran highlighted this with her case study, that it's really those communication partners who know the AAC user the best, who know what those family stories are, what's funny, what's not funny, what's going to evoke that response. And bearing in mind that trauma-informed practice where we want to make sure that we're telling the right kinds of stories for that person, it's not as easy as you would first maybe think to identify those stories. So if we just nip to the next slide, Fran. We started easy. We started with news because this was the first thing that, you know, people can think of what they've immediately just done. They've been to Centre Parks, they painted a mug, cousins and her dad read favourite stories every night, and these are the familiar, easy storytelling things. So these are the things. This is the news page, so this is the page that's going to change. This is not a story that's forever, unless, you know, going to Centre Parks becomes a family thing that happens all the time, and the person wants to talk all the time about Centre Parks and tell different stories about Centre Parks. This will be a lovely place to start, positive place to start, but the news will change based on what's happened in the recent past. So within the vocabulary, there's a really nice structure to this, and I've used the birth of O's sibling nearly a year ago now, really, to highlight to the family the type of stories that can be told. So I've put to sort of show them and to help them through this process of identifying stories. We've identified a really significant family event, the birth of a new sibling, and then if we go to the next slide, Fran, we can see then how this can be structured in terms of that story retrieval and storage of that story for O as an AAC user. So we've got that narrative structure that Fran had used within her story albums, that a lot of therapists will be very familiar with that narrative structure: who, where, when, what happened, how I felt, and further information. And every story will have that structure so that it'll enable him with his story retrieval and to know that who's in the same place, where is in the same place each time. And then in terms of the story narration, the communication partners will need some communication partner training in order to help tell the story interactively. But the personal photograph really does help that element, as a personal photograph draws really natural communication from the communication partner. And we can see how we do that ourselves in personal storytelling. If we've got something that we want to tell someone, one of the first things we'll do is to grab our phone and say, oh, I've got a picture of that, let me show you. And then we'll use that picture as a reference in order to talk about the story. So the fact that in this vocabulary, there's a large photograph in the middle as a reference point to help with that narration and that interactive nature of the storytelling, even at a simple vocabulary level, I think is a really important and nice tool for that, as well as Fran said, with it being a memory jog for the person. And then as Fran and I were talking, we started talking about how some stories are forever stories, how they're told and retold and retold and become family folklore. And those would be the things that we'd put on the story page. The news stories would be more complex stories that had happened in the last week or the last, the last school holiday or whatever. But we always have those stories that we want to tell immediately. So, for example, something that's happened in the hall and we want to tell everyone when we get back to class. I saw the head teacher doing a dance in the hall or whatever it is. Then they can go back into class with those sequential messages stored and tell that narrative immediately. And these narratives are just a story for today. We want to tell them there and then. And then if we want to tell them and we think it's really funny, we might put it onto news or onto those more sort of forever stories. But, I think if we start to think about, is this a story for now? Is this a story for news? Is this a story for forever? And that's quite a nice way to be thinking about what we're going to say and where we're going to put them. And then this one, the last case study, this is an adult we were working with who had a really interesting career, had lived in various countries and had experienced a traumatic brain injury, and as a result had severe dysarthria. But interestingly enough, no significant cognitive impairment. She had touchscreen access, very motivated communicator, a lot to say and a lot of personal stories to tell, and very well supported by families. Initially using a low-tech spelling board at initial assessment, but for those longer stories, her communication partners were struggling to keep up with everything being spelt letter by letter. She could do that far better than communication partners listening to that letter by letter communication style. And so this is how, from that first page, when we hit messages, this is how this looked. Quick fire messages, greetings, all of that. So we used the fact that we had extra categories within there to just start to give her the skeleton. If we nip to the next slide, Fran, thank you. Just putting some of that who, where, when, what happened, vocabulary within one of those categories, so that she could start to add her own stories to that. And it's literally just, as Fran said, we're just starting this journey now. So all we've done for her is give her the skeleton of that, of some of those things. It's about someone, and it's where I did it. And yeah, just starting to give those personal narratives and that skeleton structure for her.
So one of the big things as speech and language therapists, we often are asked about kind of assessment, how we're going to evidence progress. And I wanted to look into this a little bit more, particularly if I was kind of justifying a block of input on storytelling with my AAC users, just to check how I would evidence and break down that progress. And the book that Andrea referred to at the start of the webinar was really useful to start that discussion about assessment frameworks. So Grove and Harwood, they spoke about frameworks that have been used to profile skills across different dimensions. So looking at things like the structure of the story, so the person's memory and sequencing for events, the feelings, the range of verbal and non-verbal emotions that are kind of shown within a story, the social skill development. So is the individual able to maintain the communication partner's attention? And then that linguistic competence, which Andrea referred to earlier, about that kind of vocabulary use, sentence construction, and how all of that comes together. But interestingly, for kind of non-verbal individuals, there was a lot of kind of group storytelling and a lot of projects that focused on using frameworks which may be familiar to speech and language therapists also on this webinar, particularly if you're familiar with the intensive interaction approach. But the levels of participation were recorded using the framework by Brown in 1996. So looking at stages like encounter, where the learner may be present during activity but shows no apparent awareness. Then moving up to things like engagement, where the user may attend and show more consistent responses to events, to all the way up to the involvement stage, where that individual is spontaneously and actively joining in. And I just wanted to make another quick note about something that I learned about when reading the book about cultural issues, which I thought was really important and interesting to mention. So personal storytelling is a very culturally specific activity. So I learned that Japanese, African American, and Hispanic cultures, for example, they tell anecdotes in a way that may differ from the expectations of white, Western educated teachers. So Japanese stories tend to be more concise, African American tend to be more elaborated, and Hispanic tends to have that more focus on family, friends, and relationships. So it's just coming back to how important it is to work out with families how and when they tell those stories, and if there are any cultural constraints, what they are, and whether there are any specific kind of conventions they use. So it just means that there's lots more exciting opportunities to learn from the people around the client and the client themselves, and involve them in the work that you're doing. So we just wanted to conclude with kind of a few top tips, and I've put here about SALT sessions, but I would say this is for any session that anybody's doing with an AAC user, to just create space to share, for the AAC users to share that story, and work with communication partners to support them to actively listen. So Andrea spoke about communication partner training, which is within the remit of ASSAULT specifically. But definitely within other sessions, you know, at the start of, say, physio or OT sessions or teaching sessions, you know, there's often, how are you? How is your you know, how was your weekend? What have you been up to? Or if you're starting an initial assessment and you've never met anybody before, asking them a little bit more about them. So I'd say that's relevant to a number of professionals, really. Considering those cultural issues and working with the key communication partners as much as possible. Just a little tip I thought was to have a camera handy or a quick diary or notepad to kind of capture those important events, which can be used as prompts or jot interesting things down throughout the week. And both those methods can kind of aid recall when preparing the AAC device and or giving prompting or scaffolding during that subsequent narration. If we think about transitions as well, they're really powerful opportunities to provide and share stories. And just kind of coming back to that kind of practice is everything. So it's important for the client and the communication partners to just have lots of practice of sharing their stories, tweaking those, expanding those, and yeah, adding to them over time. And finally, the importance of working as a team to make sure that the stories on the individual's device are relevant, trauma-informed, and motivating, most importantly. So to conclude, telling and retelling stories is an essential part of language development. Narrating a story is an interactive process, which hopefully we've hammered home today. Studies in which children were given the ability to relate past experience interactively suggest that children are able to take more control in a conversation if they have access to personal stories, which is just brilliant given the kind of evidence and research that Andrea was kind of showing earlier. And also it can really impact somebody's self-esteem positively. But it is a difficult area dependent on the client, the personal communication style, the vocabulary, layout, and like we've mentioned, we're still in the early stages of thinking about this. But I just wanted at this point to say special thanks to Anna Lou to helping us to start this journey, thinking and using storytelling more within our sessions. And hopefully the webinar today has sparked a little bit of inspiration and motivation in others. References, please get in touch if you would like those. They're available on request. And thank you very much for listening. Please email with any comments or questions, and we will be putting the My Stories grid set on our website under the resources section under grid sets. So please feel free to download that if that will benefit anybody that you know or are working with. Just to also mention as well, we have a wealth of kind of training material on our YouTube channel. We have TikTok, Facebook, Instagram. There's lots of different social media platforms for freebies and great content and also strategies. So yes, please keep up to date with everything on there. Thanks again.